Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you all today for this very timely discussion. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jordan Devon. I'm the Vice Chair of JSpaceCanada and Chair of our Next Generation Committee. Today's event is the latest in our summer webinar series discussing this year's social and political developments as experienced by Israelis and Palestinians. For those who don't know, a protest movement is raging in Israel. This weekend and weekends prior, we've seen thousands of Israelis take to the streets, demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Netanyahu over charges of corruption and mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic. Opposition leaders and peace activists have lent their voices to the cause, and young Israelis are leading the charge. Today's webinar will help us understand what prompted these protests, how they played out on the ground, and the unique role played by young Israelis as activists leading the movement. To help us navigate the subject, we have with us Judy Maltz, who we can welcome back to the stage, joining us from Israel. Judy is a senior writer for the English edition of Haaretz, where she covers a wide range of topics with special emphasis on the Jewish world and Israel diaspora relations. Born and raised in the United States, Judy is based in Tel Aviv. Today, she'll offer us her on-the-ground perspective and help us understand what these protests mean for Israeli society. A moderated discussion will be followed by a 30-minute question and answer period. You can ask a question by looking at your Q&A function in the Zoom application, and feel free to write your questions, and we'll try to get to all of them. If we don't have time, we promise that we'll try our best to follow up and connect you with Judy so you can ask your question. So I don't want to take too much time with this introduction. I want to get started. So Judy, take us to Israel right now, and can you explain the most recent developments, or maybe let's start at the beginning. What prompted this protest movement?
Okay, well, I think probably you could say there was a perfect storm of a number of things happening at once. Let's first talk about the election. We've had 3 elections in the past year and a half, the last one on March 2nd. After that election, there were many Israelis on the center left feeling extremely bitter and betrayed. And the reason was that they had given their votes to parties that had promised that they would never sit in a government with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that they would never sit in a government with a man who had been indicted on criminal charges. And then what did they do? They went and joined his government. And I'm talking specifically about Kachol Lavan, the blue-white party, which emerged as basically tied with the Likud for the largest number of seats in the Knesset, more or less in each of those 3 rounds, and Labor Party. Now, just to clarify one thing, Kachol Lavan, blue-white, eventually split. There was a big fight in the party because not everyone wanted to join Netanyahu. So about half the party, led by Benny Gantz, the former chief of staff, joined Netanyahu's government. Another half the party, led by Yair Lapid, the leader of Yesh Atid, stayed in the opposition. And today, Yair Lapid is the head of the opposition. But many people felt extremely betrayed that they had given their vote to this party and to Labor, which had received much fewer votes, and that these parties then ended up joining Netanyahu. There was a sense of despair among many on the center left in Israel. Top of that, we had the coronavirus. Basically, the coronavirus hit Israel at about the same time as the election. We went into lockdown at about a week and a half after the election. Now, the coronavirus has hit Israel very, very badly, both in terms of health. If you're following what's happening in Israel, we got through the first round really with flying colors. We were considered a role model for other countries and how we handled it. But then Netanyahu, for whatever reason, decided just to let everything open. There was no strategy. Everything opened at once, and suddenly, and we are still in the midst of a very bad second round. We have today, on average, 1,500, 1,600 new cases every day. The number of people dying has gone up incredibly. We have about 800 now. And there's no end in sight for this because the government doesn't seem to have any policy or strategy. And this, of course, has upset Israelis as well. In addition, we have many, many people who have lost their jobs. We have nearly 1 million unemployed Israelis right now, which is huge. It's about 21% unemployment. And in January, just for comparison's sake, we had 3% unemployment. Lots of people without work, lots of people sick, lots of people in quarantine right now. So a lot of people feeling very, very bad and angry about the situation. So those are two factors. Then we have something that I think we might call the immediate trigger to these protests. The immediate trigger was a man that I assume many of you in Canada have never heard of. His name is Amir Haskel. He's a 67-year-old former brigadier general in the Israeli Air Force, who since retirement has actually been leading tours of soldiers and young Israelis to the death camps in Poland. He is a very principled man, and for the past 4 years, whenever he is in the country, he spends a few days a week standing at major junctions in Israel, usually at his home in a town called Yavne, with anti-Netanyahu signs. And he tries to engage people driving by, explaining to them why it is unacceptable and inconceivable that a man who has been indicted should serve as Prime Minister of Israel. He usually used to stand by himself, and if anything, he would get 2 or 3 friends or other ideologues to hang out with him. Mostly they were 60 plus years old. And he and a few of his friends also used to come on Fridays and sit out. They had a little encampment outside the Prime Minister's official residence in Jerusalem, which we call Balfour, because it's on Balfour Street in Jerusalem. Must have been about 9 weeks ago that, for whatever reason, the police decided to arrest him. They said he was standing in the street and holding up traffic, which he wasn't. He was arrested, and this made news. He was arrested, he was put in jail overnight, and he was told that he could not go near the Prime Minister's house for 14 days if he wanted to get out of jail. And he said, no, I will not agree to that. I will not agree. I am going back to the Prime Minister's house, and I have every right to do that, and I have every right to protest. And he had a lawyer with him, and the judge agreed. There was no reason to keep him away from the Prime Minister's house. After that, this got incredible coverage, this story in Israel. Suddenly, Amir Haskel, this man who for years has been protesting, he called his movement the Lone Protesters. In fact, I hung out with him last December for half a day at the junctions, just watching him. And you really have to admire this guy. You know, he left he's a grandfather with kids, grandkids, and he would spend every Friday out in the streets with his signs. Suddenly people heard about them and they were appalled. What is this? Arresting a 67-year-old former brigadier general in the Air Force for protesting? Isn't that our basic right? suddenly people started showing up at his encampment, and the numbers grew exponentially. And among those showing up were more and more young people. And I've heard more than one of them say that the reason they came was, how did we leave this to the old generation? We abandoned them. They were out there fighting for our future, for our democracy, for our right to protest, and we just left them there on their own while we were sitting in cafes and bars. Enough, we're taking over. And I think, as I said, that was a trigger. Since then, the protests have been dominated by young people, although Amir Haskell is there all the time.
That is, that's very much a comprehensive background. And we do want to focus on the role of young people in these protests, just because it is a very unique phenomenon right now, because historically, from what I understand, and tell me if I'm incorrect, young Israelis have not necessarily been at the forefront of protest movements in Israel, whether it's around the peace process, whether it's around anti-government protests against corruption. So I know you mentioned, elements like unemployment, but I guess, what would some of the folks that you've spoken to, some of the young Israelis say, is their, primary goal or outcome? And have we seen the numbers of young people grow in participation in these protests?
Yeah. So yes, we definitely have seen the number of young people grow. I was in Jerusalem last night, and it's hard to estimate percentages, but definitely more than half, maybe 75% of the people out there are in their 20s and 30s. This is very, very different if you've been living in Israel in recent years, even the past 2 or 3 decades, and you go to protests, and there are protests, political protests, but what characterizes them, or what characterized them until now, unfortunately, that most of the people had gray hair, and no offense, but the young people just had no interest. They seemed so apathetic to what was happening in their country politically and socially. You would get, I need to say that you would get young people come out to protests that involved environment, LGBT rights. Those are issues that do interest young Israelis, but politics, peace, social activism, not so much. So what happened here? I think what happened is that young Israelis had it very good for a long time. And suddenly, very, very suddenly, things started looking very bad for them. The young people have been disproportionately represented in the unemployed due to Corona. And I mentioned that we have huge 21% unemployment right now, which is huge for Israel. It is much higher among the young because young people in Israel typically are freelancers or consultants. They do not have unionized jobs. So they were the first to feel this. And among very young Israelis, like young people anywhere, you have many who were working as bartenders and waiters and waitresses. Suddenly all the restaurants were closed and their jobs were cut. Another unique Israeli phenomena is that it is very common in Israel for young people right out of the army to take off a year or even 2 and travel. They go trekking around the world. Their favorite places are the Far East and South America. Suddenly, they couldn't do that anymore. So they're out of the army with no work, no possibility of travel, and starting to think about what kind of future do I have? Now, I think many young Israelis until now never really considered corruption a big problem, or they were willing to overlook it, corruption on the part of the prime minister, because they had a good life. They could travel when they wanted, they had their freedom, they could go to cafes and they could go to clubs. So the prime minister liked to take gifts from his rich friends. Oh, you know, all leaders do that. What's so bad about that? But then I think something that happened that triggered them, and that was in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, when people are losing their jobs, when people are getting sick, when people are dying, Prime Minister Netanyahu had the Knesset Finance Committee spend an entire day on a request of his to receive some tax refund for money that had been spent on the maintenance of his private villa in Caesarea. It really rubbed people the wrong way in this country, and young people included. And I think for the first time, they started to understand what corruption is all about. Not only corruption, but what it is to have a leader who's totally out of touch with the people. How does a leader who cares about his people go and have the Knesset devote an entire day to his own personal finances? So that was another big issue here. Now I want to say something about young Israelis, talk about how they are different really, because you all know Canadians, I know Americans, and Israelis kind of young Israelis have a different path, which may explain why they tend to be, on the whole, less politically active than their peers abroad. I've mentioned the army, okay? Remember that most Israelis from ages 18 to 20 or 18 to 21 are doing their military service. That is a time when I assume most Canadians, or many young Canadians and many young Americans, are in universities, opening their minds, learning to question authority, learning to question the establishment, learning to be critical. Whereas in Israel, young people that age are going through the exact opposite. They're learning discipline and to obey orders. So it's a completely different mindset. And also they are not allowed to demonstrate if they are in the army. It's against the law for them. So remember, there's 18 to 21-year-olds, you're not going to really find them. And then, as I mentioned before, once they're out of the army, the first thing they want to do is get a backpack on their back and get out of the country and just go somewhere else. Okay, so they're not going to be around then for the next year or two. Afterward, remember, then a lot of them will work, make a little money, go to university. By the time they start university, they tend to be on average 24 years old, which is much older than their peers elsewhere. At 24, they're not going to frat parties or to football or soccer games, and they're not going to protests. They want to finish their degrees and start their lives because they start out much later than everybody else. So I think that in a way can explain why typically they aren't as socially and politically active as their peers elsewhere. At the same time, it hasn't always been the case. The Peace Now movement, which is perhaps the first anti-occupation movement to start in Israel, was founded by a group of veterans of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. These were young men who had lost friends in battle, who had seen up close how awful war can be. And young Israelis, fortunately for them, I say, those of this generation haven't really had a big war. The last big war we had was the Lebanon War. And I'm talking about the first part of it in the early 1980s. That is before the young people who are out in the streets today were even born. So they've, on the whole, had a very good life, and they haven't until now seen any reason to protest.
Thank you for that. This raises a question that I know a lot of folks at JSpaceCanada have, and it's towards the voting behavior. So I know that young Israelis aren't just politically active, but some polls that we've seen indicate that they're a little bit more right-leaning when compared to folks either living in the diaspora or outside. Just generally, they are more likely to vote for Likud or for right-wing parties. And I was wondering if you could explain that phenomenon, which I think you did a little bit, but if you could explain that, and then also say, speak a little bit to this protest movement. Is that going to change that? Are you seeing the presence of young people who voted for this current government or for Netanyahu who have changed their mind?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have some figures here I thought would be interesting. A couple months ago, actually it was back in March, just before the election, I did do a very big project about young Israelis because they've always interested me. I have 4 of my own children, and they all, I guess, fall into the category right now of young Israelis between ages 19 and 26. And always been curious about their lack of activism. So wanted to see what was going on. And so we do have some figures. These are taken from the Israel Democracy Institute did a study at the end of 2019. These are Israelis aged 18 to 24. Those who identify as left, only 9.2%. Those who identify as center, 18.1%. Those who identify as right, 69.9%. Okay? Now, when doing that, that project, I spoke to many young Israelis. And what I found that was interesting, that even though they identified as right or left or whatever, they didn't hold the views, many of them, that were typical of that particular camp. So look, we have 69.9% who identify as right, but we had 20.3% who voted for blue and white, which is considered a center or center-left party. And Likud, 23.8%. That's pretty much the same as blue and white. So they were considering themselves right-wing, but many of them, about as many as voted Likud, voted for blue and white. So also I found that young Israelis, and this will be of interest to JSpace members and supporters who are very interested in the occupation and the two-state solution and Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most young Israelis really don't know that much about the conflict. It's not something that they are taught in school. It's too controversial, actually, to teach it in school. In school, they're also not encouraged to question, and teachers are not encouraged to talk about it. It's kind of taboo. Most young Israelis who don't live there don't visit the settlements or the West Bank, and they really never see what's going on there, even though they live so close They won't cross the green line. There's really no reason for them to until they do their army service, which is probably the first time many of them ever go over the West Bank. And, the two-state solution is not something that has been discussed for a good part of their lives. It's kind of it's been off the table for many years. So it's not something that's really in their radar, the peace process, the occupation. They don't really know, and you talk to them about annexation, and I have spoken to many of them about annexation. They don't really understand what you're talking about. They don't know the lay of the land. And it's really interesting. I assume that there are many progressive young Jews in Canada and the United States who know a lot more about the conflict than young Israelis do. And that's important when we're talking about protests and why aren't they protesting? There's some awful human rights abuses going on in the occupied territories. Why aren't young Israelis? Well, they don't really know about it. They're not taught about it. They won't find out about it unless they, are really reading the newspaper every single day or reading Haaretz every single day. I should correct myself. So they wouldn't know. And so what are they protesting? When you go to these protests, you will see some anti-occupation signs, and there are definitely people on the left and young people on the left out there. But there are so many different things that people are protesting. The main thing, of course, is the government corruption. It's mishandling of the pandemic. But you will see women out there protesting, and young women too, protesting because they want more women in government. This latest Knesset of ours that was sworn in a few months ago has the fewest number of women, by the way, in many, many years. There was not even a woman in the special Corona cabinet that they set up. So, some people are there for feminist reasons. We had a terrible story a few days ago about a young 16-year-old girl who was gang raped, allegedly, in Eilat, which is a southern resort city. So last night, for example, I saw people out there protesting that. There are people protesting police violence. The police have become quite violent, especially last night. This was kind of a game changer in terms of how police were acting. So there are so many causes. Everyone comes to these protests, by the way, with their own handmade signs, and everyone has another issue. And it's just like a place, if you're angry about something, come out there, bring your sign, try to get more people engaged. And the one thing they have in common, that everyone has in common there, is that they want to see an end to the Netanyahu regime. And by the way, many of these young protesters can hardly remember a time that Netanyahu was not prime minister of Israel. Remember, he was prime minister between 1996 and 1999. Then he came back 10 years later, and since 2009, nonstop, he has been prime minister. They don't know anything else. And, they're sick of it.
So do you think this will make a difference on the voting behavior patterns of young Israelis at the ballot box?
If you look at recent polls, what they show is that the Likud is losing a lot of support. Unfortunately, the party that is gaining support, or a lot of the support that Likud is losing, is a party called Yamina, which is a right-wing religious party. And that is a party headed by Naftali Bennett, who is in the opposition now, by the way. Interestingly, the opposition has Naftali Bennett and it has the joint list. So it is very, very diverse, the opposition right now. It's hard to say where this will go. The one hopeful thing, I think a lot of young Israelis didn't vote. They just didn't care. And now they do care. And I can't imagine that any of the young people who are out there in the streets, who have been out there in recent months, who didn't vote, will now go and vote Likud or even Yamina. If they didn't vote now, they will vote for a party they can be sure will try to oust Netanyahu. But again, I think it's too early to say anything based on the polls. The biggest problem right now is that the center left really doesn't have a leader or anyone who can galvanize all this rage in the streets. And they're just, like I said, there's Lapid, who is the opposition leader, but there seems to be a consensus that he doesn't really have what it takes. We need someone who has more charisma, who is more respected. Hopefully, someone will emerge from this protest, because it looks like, we'll know within the next day and a half, but we may have another election coming up in November. So the center left will have to get its act together very soon. And I think that once there is an acknowledged leader of the center left camp, we'll start to see a change in the polls. More people moving away from Netanyahu, not only to the Yamina party, but maybe to new center left option or leader.
And when we talk about leadership, have you seen any leaders emerge? Just obviously, you mentioned the individual who sparked, or reignited the interest in these protests. Mm-hmm. But have we seen any new leaders, specifically among youth of the next generation, be a consistent force in mobilizing folks for change, or a leader at least on, as you say, the center left, come out of these protests?
No, we haven't. It's interesting. Now, you may remember that in 2011, we had very big social protests here in Israel. At one point, there were even 500,000 people in the streets. And out of that protest movement was also a very, very young movement. We had two of the leaders of that movement, Stav Shafir and Itzik Shmuli, eventually joined the Labor Party and became very prominent members of the Labor Party. Stav Shafir is not in politics at the moment, and Itzik Shmuli is now a member of the Netanyahu government. So I think people are scared of that happening again. And it's kind of nice right now in a way that there's no leadership. It's what you call in Hebrew a balagan. It's a big mess, but it's nice. There's all these different groups, no leaders. One of the groups, by the way, is called the Black Flag Movement. And these are people who go out every Saturday evening for a couple of hours onto the bridges and major junctions, and they hold black flags. And they tend to be more on the left. But then you have many, many self-employed small business owners who have suffered terribly from the coronavirus. Many of them were Likud supporters who are now joining the protests. It is very possible that among that group, traditional kind of Likud supporters, you will have people moving to the center-left camp. And then there are just, other movements. There's so many different groups and organizations involved, but no leader at this point. Someone will have to emerge before the next election. We'll just have to wait.
And I know that we've been talking about Israeli youth and the Israeli public, and I don't want to essentialize the different groups within that. And obviously, a very important population within Israel is the Arab population. So I'm curious to see to what degree there have been Arab youth activists or representatives of the Joint List or the different Arab political factions represented in these protests.
Mm-hmm. The protests, if you go to the protests, you'll see it's a very broad spectrum of Israeli society represented there, contrary to Netanyahu's tendency to depict the protesters as Ashkenazi elites or leftists or anarchists. No, they're tax-paying Israelis who serve in the army, most of them, who love their country, but who are very, very angry. But you will see that there are, I guess, two prominent groups who aren't there. One is religious Israelis. Now, religious Israelis, it can't be that the fact that they're not there, that we need to interpret that as they're supporting Netanyahu's corruption. I think they just simply don't feel comfortable in the crowd. And there has been talk of some of these right-wingers who might have their own anti-Netanyahu protests, but they don't want to be affiliated with this particular group. So there are, you will see yarmulkes in the crowd, but few and far between. And the other group is Arab Israelis. But you will see their leadership there. Ayman Odeh, who is the head of the Joint List, comes to almost every protest on Saturday nights. I should mention, there are different protests through the week. There's the big Saturday night protest, and that one typically gets between 10 and 20,000 people. There's a protest every Thursday night, which is a little smaller at the same place. And there is every Friday at 4 o'clock a Kabbalat Shabbat, a greeting the Shabbat kind of ceremony that takes place outside the Prime Minister's home. And this week, actually, they had 5,000 people there, which is quite a crowd. So Ayman Odeh is there. Ahmed Tibi has come to a few of the protests. Aida Tumas Suleiman, who is also a member of the communist faction of the Joint List, has been there. But I haven't seen many young Arab Israelis there. What I have seen, which is interesting, is that in the Black Flag protests on the bridge, there's a big bridge in northern Israel near a bunch of Druze towns. Druze are an Arabic-speaking minority in Israel. They are often referred to as Arabs. They do serve in the army, though, in contrast to the majority of Arab citizens. So in this one bridge in northern Israel, which is near many Druze towns and villages, there have been many, many Druze citizens coming out in recent weeks with black flags to the bridge, which is very, very interesting. Hard to say why it hasn't caught on. There have been Arab citizens participating there have been a few kind of sporadic protests in Haifa, and Haifa is a mixed Jewish Arab city, and there you did see Arab protesters, but they're not coming in buses at this point, at least to Balfour, Jerusalem.
And I think I'll end my series of questions after this. But I guess, what do we think the potential outcomes are going to be? And I guess second to that is what are the preferred outcomes? Obviously, the resignation of Netanyahu, but what would, if when you talk to protesters, what would they say is the success that they want to see with this movement?
So, as you said, I think everyone, the common denominator, everyone has different objectives, but the common denominator, I think everyone would just be happy to see Netanyahu out. For some people, it doesn't matter if the Likud is still the ruling party, and so long as another member of the party serves as prime minister. Many people, of course, would prefer that Likud is not the ruling party and that some other big party or the center left, after so many years, is given another chance to take over leadership. And only then can we start talking about some of the things like getting back to the negotiating table with the Palestinians, ending the occupation, ending the settlement movement, but it's too early for all that. We have to take baby steps right now. And the first step is for Netanyahu to be out of the prime minister's office. Now, in terms of what are the factors that could affect where this protest movement goes, well, a critical factor, which I've mentioned before and we will know about in a day and a half, is whether or not we're having a fourth election. Tomorrow night is a deadline. They have to reach some agreement about the budget, the Likud and Blue-White. If they don't reach an agreement by tomorrow night, we are automatically going for elections in November. So I think that could probably inject some more adrenaline even into this protest movement. If the option of an election so soon becomes a reality. The other thing is, every week there's concerns like, how are we going to maintain this? How are the organizers going to keep getting out 10, 15, 20,000 people every Saturday night? So there's always little things that happen in the week that make people angry and they say, oh, I'm going out to protest. So last week what happened was that encampment that I mentioned to you where Amir Haskell used to sit with his friends, it's still there. And there are still a bunch of veteran types like him who spend the entire day there and sleep out there, actually. The police came last week and basically pulled down the whole encampment to make room for what was expected to be a major protest, a pro-Netanyahu demonstration. They were expecting thousands. In the end, only a few hundred showed up, and that is very telling. But while they were taking down this encampment, some of the protesters, Haskell was there, and a former head of the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli Secret Service, was there protesting as well, and they had handcuffed themselves to the police barriers. And they were eventually injured and arrested, and that got people very, very angry. So that's why I think you saw big numbers come out again this Saturday night. What happened this Saturday night is that there was a lot of police violence. And, police tend not to be that violent in protests in Israel. If they're violent, it's against certain groups. There's violence against Arabs, there's violence against ultra-Orthodox protesters, there's been violence against Ethiopian protesters. But this kind of mainstream Israeli group that we have at the protests outside Balfour usually are not the victims of police violence. Yesterday, the police kind of lost it and started beating up people. And again, that's something that will probably bring more people out next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judy. I'm going to now open it up to questions from our audience. So we have a few questions in the queue. If you have any questions, we encourage you to write them in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. One question asks, how do Haaretz and the Joint List connect with these protests? And I know you spoke a little bit about the Joint List, but Haaretz, which I'll have you identify what it is. Are there leaders in Haaretz that are involved with the protests?
Haaretz Knesset members do show up at the protests. I know that Nitzan Haaretz, who heads the party, was there last night, and I believe he comes every week. And I believe that Tamar Zandberg, who is another member of the party, was there last night, as well as Yair Golan, who's not really Meretz, but he kind of is part of the party now. He's a former deputy chief of staff.
Sorry to interrupt, but just for clarity, Meretz is the most left-wing party that identifies as Zionist still, correct?
Right. Meretz is the most left-wing party that identifies as Zionist. Now, Meretz obviously supports the protests, and they're out there, and there are, I would assume, all Meretz voters support what's going on, and you will find many Meretz voters. I know many Meretz voters who I see out there, but the organizations involved in these protests have been very careful about not hooking up with any political parties, because right now they have a good thing going and lots of people are coming out. Remember, this is Corona times. There's no public transportation. People drive on their own every Friday night from around the country. And risk their health because it's very crowded there. It's for people who need to be careful about catching this horrible disease, it's not a good place to be. The people are still coming in huge numbers. And the idea is, why let a political party, as great as its goals may be, capitalize on this? Right now, it's a grassroots movement. It's a growing grassroots movement, and let's try to grow on our own. There's no election at the moment, so let's keep this going, and when elections are called, then we can start maybe making it a little bit more political.
Thanks. There's two questions here that are similar, so I think I'm going to put them together. One asks, you mentioned that some protesters would be okay with Likud remaining in power if Netanyahu potentially stepped down. Is there support for that within the Likud party? And then another question asks, is it possible that more young people would join Likud, take it over, and maybe shift it a little politically?
So the first question again was, is there
support within Likud, within members of the Likud party, for a shift in leadership and maybe acknowledging protesters' concerns and having Netanyahu step down and someone take the helm?
So I think, in private conversations, Likud members or Likud parliamentarians, Likud ministers, they would all agree that Netanyahu is becoming a big liability for them in a certain way, even though, as I said, in the polls, Likud still does relatively well, not as good as it was doing a couple months ago, but still doing relatively well. But he's becoming a liability, he and his family. But there seems to be no one, with any courage in Likud these days to call him out, or doesn't seem to be any attempt to conspire behind his back and say, let's just, nominate somebody else or reach an agreement with Kahol Lavan to bring somebody else as our prime minister. Right now, everyone seems to be afraid of him and afraid to do anything like that. I don't really see it happening. Before the last election, there was an internal leadership battle in Likud between Netanyahu and Gidon Sa'ar, who's a former minister. And basically, Netanyahu creamed him in the race. Well, it was no race, so nobody really wants to go there right now, I think. And the second question, just remind me again.
Second question was, would this lead to potentially more folks joining political parties, and specifically the Likud, to maybe shift it politically to their interests?
I don't see that happening, joining Likud. I think maybe, there will be more young people being involved politically now, that, those who have become involved in the protest movement, who weren't active in politics before, now they're starting to be interested in what's happening in the country and to care. And so maybe they will become more politically involved, but I definitely don't see Likud in any way benefiting from what's going on right now among young people, for sure.
One question asks, and it touches on something you spoke about, but maybe they're asking for you to elaborate a little bit more, on the degree to which protests have focused on the prospect of annexation, and specifically opposing the government's plans to annex territory in the West Bank, and how powerful has that presence been at these protests?
Look, I would say that most of the people who come to the protests without conducting any scientific survey are against annexation and were against annexation. Right now, it's completely off the table, as you know, because of this agreement we have with the United Arab Emirates. So it wasn't even an issue last night. Like, I didn't see any of the signs I had seen previously about annexation. And certainly there are no people who are coming to these protests, and there weren't any who were pro-annexation. That this is not their scene. I think that what we learned from this whole ordeal with the annexation in recent months is how little most Israelis care about it. And I think that's something that bothered them with Netanyahu, that he seemed to be so obsessed with pushing this annexation plan through at a time when, we had the coronavirus, unemployment, people were angry. Things were going really badly in this country, and really, who cares? Who wanted this? So it was part of this, him being out of touch with what are the real concerns of the people. And unless you happen to be part of that very small minority of Israelis who live in the settlements, what did you care whether or not Israel had sovereign? I mean, if you were of the left, you did not want Israel to extend sovereignty there. But even if you weren't, it wasn't an issue that affected you day to day. And it seemed so kind of heartless of Netanyahu at a time when the country is going through these bad times to obsess about something that most people don't care about.
And you mentioned the UAE, so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question, and I just saw that we got one. Obviously, there was a historic deal reached to normalize ties between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Has that shifted public opinion on Netanyahu? Has that stunted the growth of the protests at all?
We saw there were one or two polls that came out right after. One of them showed that Likud was doing a tiny bit better, and one of them showed that it was doing a tiny bit worse. So I guess on average, no effect. Very
interesting. One question brings us back to the time preceding these protests, which is how exactly did the government mishandle their response to COVID-19?
Initially, Israel went into, I think Israel was one of the first countries to go into lockdown, and there were very, very strict restrictions here involving social distancing. We were not allowed to go more than a few dozen meters outside of our homes. There was a few weeks when, in Passover, there was a complete curfew. You weren't allowed out of the house, and we had a very small number of cases then. Now, in retrospect, at the time, there was no government. It was just after the elections, and both Netanyahu and Benny Gantz of the Blue-White Party were trying to form a government, and each of them failed in turn until they decided to form one together. once that government was formed, it seemed that Netanyahu suddenly felt, okay, there's no reason, I have no reason to cause any panic anymore, because really he was causing panic in the beginning, and it was part of his ploy to get the blue-white party to join him in a government. And part of the blue-white party fell for it. And the irony, the very sad irony, is that since this, what was called an emergency coronavirus government was formed, is that things have gone terrible. They were much better before the government was formed. So once the government was formed, Netanyahu said, okay, everyone's calling me, leaders all around the world, they want to know, how did we do it? And, we are just this role model for the world. And then you open the economy way too fast, and the number of cases started skyrocketing. There was no, gradual exit from this. Everything open at once. It started in the schools, and then there were in the synagogues, and wedding halls, and restaurants. And then what they started doing is they didn't know how to take control. So they would say, okay, we're closing the swimming pools tomorrow, but we're opening restaurants. Okay, no good. There were protests. Okay, so we'll close the restaurants and open the swimming pools. And the truth is, no, you can wear masks here, but you can't wear them here. And every day they were changing the rules, bowing to pressure from different groups. And, there was one crazy morning that they said all restaurants will be closed tomorrow morning. They didn't give the restaurateurs enough time, so many of them had already purchased products to cook in their restaurants the next day, and it was all going to rot. The restaurateurs came out in protest, so they announced, okay, fine, you can open the restaurants. By then, not all the restaurants had been prepared, so some were open, some were closed, so it's just been this crazy, chaotic mess, basically just giving into group pressures. And as I said, things are a lot worse now. It just feels for most Israelis that nobody is in control and nobody knows what they're doing.
One attendee asks, is there a danger of disillusionment if the protests don't need to change?
Sorry?
If there's a danger of disillusionment if the protests don't achieve their goals or if they don't need to change?
If we have another election in November and Netanyahu wins again, I mean, Israelis.
It really feels like Groundhog Day. I must say, Judy, I feel like we had you on this screen talking about the election a few months ago, and I feel like we might be welcoming you again to this stage to be talking about this exact same thing.
Right. So the only thing that could make a big difference now is that even if he is elected again in November, we may get Joe Biden. So that could change things. That could, he would have to control himself then a lot more. He wouldn't have the free hand that he had from Donald Trump. But yes, it would cause a lot of disillusionment, especially for these young people who are for the first time becoming active and feeling very empowered. They are definitely feeling empowered, and they're, if you drive down the main highways of Israel on a Saturday night, it's an amazing experience because you will see people out on all the bridges with their masks and with their flags, the black flags and the blue and white flags. And it's amazing. It's really, we took our daughter, 24-year-old daughter, a couple weeks ago for the first time. And she was really blown away. She's not one who typically protested, and she wanted to come that time. And she could not believe this. It's very moving. And there is this sense of empowerment that, we're strong. There's a lot of people who feel as we do now. So maybe we can change.
Interesting. I know we are upon the hour, so I'll answer, or we'll get to a few more questions, and I'll make sure if we didn't get to your question to follow up. You mentioned the 2011 protests, and so one question asks, can we learn anything about the social protest movement of 2011, which did see some young people involved that could show promise for what might emerge from the current protests?
I think the big lesson of the protests of 2011 for many who were part of that is actually keep going. Don't believe the government if they come out and start offering you things to stop these protests. Because what ended the protest movement in 2011 was that Netanyahu, who was prime minister then as well, he said, okay, you've got legitimate demands. Let's sit down and talk and we'll try to meet your demands, which in the end he didn't. Maybe they lowered the price of cottage cheese. That was the big achievement of the protests of 2011. And we saw a little bit of that happening a few weeks ago when our police minister, Amir Ohana, who is very, very close to Netanyahu, suddenly reached out to several of the leaders of the protests, including Amir Haskell, and said, come, let's sit down and talk. What do you want? Clearly, the Likud and Netanyahu do not like these protests at all, and they are trying to stop them. And he thought he could sweet talk the leaders into, let's reach some agreement. What are you demanding? Blah, blah. But they didn't fall for it, which was good. They didn't fall into the trap and said, we have nothing to talk about with you right now, and we will continue those protests. So I think that, in a way, was the big takeaway, is that, you know, keep going. Don't believe them. They want to end this. They'll offer you things, and then they won't follow through.
That's very interesting. And I know, I even know some folks who were involved in the 2011 protests, and they were a little disillusioned. They were very happy with the role that Stav Shafir played in kind of her ascension to Israeli politics. So it's very interesting to see that she's also actively involved. So maybe it will lead to some new political leaders entering the arena.
Look at where she is today and where Shmuley is today, right? It's kind of sad.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I'm gonna pick these two questions that are very similar that I'm gonna draw on for this last question, which is, how can diaspora Jews support progressives in Israel, and how can we build? The second question is, how can we build alliances between the diaspora and Israeli youth, and how can we ensure that both groups are educated about each other, educated about the issue, educated about the conflict, and I guess the milieus that we both find ourselves in?
It's very hard these days during Corona times when we can't visit each other, right? Because I would, if it were any other time, I'd say, hop on a plane, come experience a protest. It's really something to experience, and I'm sure they would get a lot out of it. You know, what can I tell you these days? Follow, you know, some of the activists in the movement are very active on social media. Unfortunately, mostly in Hebrew, but it's, you know, it's a good excuse to brush up on your Hebrew, right? And then you can follow what's going on, engage with them, share their tweets. You know, I think the young Israelis who are involved in this protest movement, they're also looking for advice from young Jews abroad who've been involved in protest movements, who know about strategies and tactics and how to gain more and more support among their peers. And they are looking for people to turn to. So I'd say go on social media, find the people, contact them, set up your own Zoom forums where you can update one another and exchange ideas. And I'm sure there are many young progressive Jews in Canada who have experience in protests and causes and advocacy work who can help them because they're very new to this.
Absolutely. On that note, I think I'll close up today's program. I just wanted to thank you again, Judy, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to hear your perspective and have you give us the important insights from on the ground and what's happening in Israel. Everyone today who's joined us, thank you so much. These questions have been lovely. Again, if we didn't get to them, our apologies, and we'll do our best to follow up.
Send them my email.
We'll be following up.
My email.
Yes, we will make sure to send your email, so you can also reach out directly to Judy. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how you can directly support programs like today's event. As an all-volunteer organization, JSpaceCanada relies on the generous donations of folks across Canada, and we would really appreciate if you have the ability to do so to support us by making a tax-deductible donation, which we'll send the link for, or through becoming a member, which gives you exclusive access to our year-round programming and discounted rates for our ticketed events. And I wanted to specifically call out the young folks who are on today's call. Thank you for joining us. We have some really exciting programs and initiatives planned for the fall. And if you want to get involved, you can always give us a shout at our email, which we'll put on our follow-up update for everyone. And you can always reach out via our social media or on our website. We're very, very excited about the things that we've planned, and we're very, very excited about today's event. So thanks again, and until we speak again, be safe, be well, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.